Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from today. Welcome to today's webinar, Biometrics and the New Era of National Security and Border Control. And we have a very hot global topic today. My name is Peter O'Neill, and I am the president of Find Biometrics and Mobile ID World. And it's a very exciting time for us because of the amount of interest in biometrics globally. Not just border control and national security, but financial and fintech, healthcare, and watch out for enterprise-wide security now that we have physical, logical, digital, and mobility all converging in the enterprise. The global interest in biometrics has never been higher than it is right now. In fact, I'm very pleased to have been invited to chair 2 sessions at the Mobile World Congress in Shanghai next week with 70,000 of my closest colleagues. Our mission at Find Biometrics and Mobile ID World is to make sure that biometrics and mobile identification in conjunction with privacy, convenience, and security have a strong voice at end-user gatherings like Mobile World Congress. My first section next week is focusing on cybersecurity with the help and support from McKinsey, Intel, Nokia, Ericsson, Sensory Biometrics, NEC China, and Huawei. Yikes. And the second session is on mobile identity with some real heavy hitters, the president and CEO of Ericsson, the president of KDDI Japan, and the CEO of Telnor Pakistan, all huge telco players. It'll be very interesting to get their take on biometrics and mobile identification. So if any attendees today are planning to be in Shanghai, please come to one of my sessions or drop me an email. I'd be happy to meet with you in Shanghai. And so we'll be reporting lots from Shanghai, but be sure to stay on top of all the breaking news by visiting Find Biometrics and our sister site, Mobile ID World. And all this month, all month long, we have been focusing on border control and national ID. So we have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to jump right in. Please note, to ask a question, just type it into the dialog box in the Go To Control panel on the right side of your screens. And please do this at any time. Don't wait until the end, as this will give us a chance to moderate the questions and make sure that we're getting an opportunity to answer as many as possible at the end. And I have a feeling there'll be lots on this particular topic. This webinar will last about 40 minutes in total and will be recorded and available at findbiometrics.com. I'd now like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors for their continuing support, NEC and MorphoTrack, and a special thanks to Acuity Market Intelligence. And to start off our discussions today, we are again very fortunate to have with us none other than the industry's brightest, boldest, and best analyst and consultant, Maxine Most. Max is the principal of Acuity Market Intelligence, and I've known Max well for about 14 years, and she is known for providing original, thought-provoking, accurate, and very reliable industry analysis. Basically, Max is the best in the business. In fact, if you ever want to brainstorm where our industry will be in 5 years, Max is the person you'll want at the table. For example, she actually predicted the whole mobile shift in our industry years before Apple bought Authentication. Both Max and I speak at or attend most of the biometric conferences held every year around the world, and Max will now be providing us with her latest thinking to kick things off. I am so pleased to introduce our presenter today, the mighty Maxine Most.
Thank you very much, Peter. As I've said before, I actually don't pay him to say these things, but I would like him introducing me wherever I go. Thanks so much, Peter. So I think today's topic is really interesting given the dynamics of what's going on in the marketplace right now. And I'm sure, as most of you know, there are forces that are driving market development from every direction. Not only, sort of the mainstreaming of biometrics on mobile devices and the sort of global rise of digital identity, but more immediate issues like massive immigration, legal, illegal, and based on refugee status, the dynamic and now very mobile threats that terrorism pose across the world. Combine that with technology developments like faster, cheaper, and essentially better biometrics, the move towards cloud-based identity, and then layer that on top of a national security and border control infrastructure that has specific limitations and constraints, and the need to actually improve facilitation through choke points, both to ensure that the existing infrastructure we have is adequate and that we can actually move people through those environments in a secure way. And you have an extremely dynamic market that is trying to respond to just an overwhelming number of forces that are driving the decisions that have to be made, the technology that has to be used, and the processes that have to be put in place. Can you shift slides, Peter? There we go. Okay. So the first thing that I want to do is just throw some data at you, because as those of you that know me, I am a data hound. I'm data driven, and Acuity really prides itself on being a very data driven analyst organization, if you will. This just gives you an idea of where eGates are today in terms of looking at the global landscape. The vast majority exist in Asia, followed by somewhat closely by Europe, and then really the Middle East. Those are the three areas where we've seen really sort of some mass deployments of eGates. I think that we will certainly see more eGates on the horizon. However, given the existing infrastructure, I think the proportions are likely to stay pretty close to this for the near term. Eventually, we may see a lot more infrastructure development in Africa, but I think that's something that really we're looking at 5 years out for sort of major deployments in that area. So I think this is something where we're likely going to see Asia, the Middle East, and Europe really lead the way. APC kiosks are really interesting because this has been a technology that has been rapidly deployed. Now, this is really North America centric. And those of you that aren't familiar with this technology, the kiosks are deployed at entry points in airports and in the United States, and actually I think now one cruise port in Canada. The problem was several years ago we had massive backups in immigration coming in to the United States, and passport control, I should say, and we had wait times in the range of 2, 3, and 4 hours, and the CBP, which is the border control agency here in the U.S., was under tremendous pressure to work with the airports to come up with a solution. And so essentially there was a massive rollout in kiosks, these APC kiosks, which essentially allow you to self-check in with your passport and answer some of those questions they ask you. They ask on those little forms that you fill out when you come into the United States or other countries. It's a semi-automated process. You interact with the APC kiosk, you still have to see a border agent who confirms that information before you're cleared. But the automating part of this process has had a radical effect on wait times, and we've seen decreases anywhere from 30 to 60% across the board, and that's for all folks going through passport control, not just those using the kiosk. So the introduction of this technology alleviated the problem, and we really saw massive adoption from something like, I think 200 of these were deployed, but 250 were deployed at the end of 2014, and by the beginning of 2016, there were well over 12 or 1,300. So in terms of units, it was a pretty radically quick deployment of automated border control. I believe this technology is going to catch on and spread across the regions of the world. It hasn't really yet, but it's a very low-cost technology. Again, it is semi-automatic, but it's relatively easy and quick to deploy and has powerful impact. So this is something that I think we have to watch as the global automated border control market moves forward. just to give you an update sort of on where we are with e-passports, and obviously this is critical because any kind of biometric-based border control system, automated border control system, relies on being able to positively link an individual to their credential, and what that means is biometrics. And so what we're seeing is, in terms of the percentage of e-passports that are, the percentage of passports that are actually in circulation that are e-passports is fairly high today. We have overall close to 80%, and we will see that increase to over 90% by 2020. And that obviously changes the game in terms of having a global platform where we have biometric credentials issued. So then one of the other factors, as I said, was mobile devices. So here's some data on mobile devices. This is really interesting in terms of the volume that we expect to see of biometric mobile devices. We are now looking at really, over a billion devices, mobile biometric devices that are out in the marketplace, and would expect, and this again, this is the annual units, and we would expect to see by 2020 really in the range of 3 billion of these units out in the marketplace, which is on an annual basis, which is pretty astounding. But if you look at the next slide in particular, what this is showing is that essentially by I believe by 2018, close to 2018, 2020 at the most, all mobile devices are essentially, and in this case we're talking about smartphones, tablets, and wearables, are going to be biometrically enabled. In the last 2 years, over 200, or last 2.5 years, 3 years, to over 200 mobile smartphones alone have been introduced into the marketplace. So again, this goes to having a global identification platform, not just in the form of a credential that is issued, i.e. our passports, but in terms of almost, a vast majority of the traveling public having a biometric mobile device they are carrying with them that allows a much higher level of authentication than we've ever had before.
Max, I like this slide because it shows the speed of what's happening in a lot of biometric mobility. The non-biometric smart devices just rapidly decreasing almost to nothing in a very short period of time.
Yeah, because when I first came out with this in 2014, people thought I was crazy, that I was willing to say, look, I think by 2018, 2020, we're talking about near 100% penetration. But if you look at what's going on with the smartphone market today, and recently with tablet announcements, I'm pretty confident that we're going to get very close to this mark, meet this mark. So then, just in terms of looking at passports, right? So now we have this high level of penetration of e-passports in the marketplace, and we're also seeing this move towards mass adoption of biometrics in smart devices. And what does that mean? It means that eventually these credentials are moving into those devices that we're all carrying. Now, I think it's really interesting because I just tweeted this out recently. One of the directors at IATA was speaking at a conference recently and said that he believed that e-passport booklets were here to stay for quite some time. And his justification was that in order to actually move to digital credentials, all these countries across the world that are accepting passports then have to have the infrastructure to accept digital credentials. I understand, his perspective, but I also believe that we may see faster movement in this direction than might have been anticipated. Again, this will not be the kind of curve that we saw with overall biometric adoption in mobile devices, and as Peter said, that's something that I think is pretty startling. But I do believe that there is going to be a very strong, deliberate move towards the digitalization of our secure credentials, and you could make the same argument for national IDs as well. So what does that mean? What that means is we're moving towards this process of really heavily automated border control, facilitated border control. And this is, this is sort of a classic diagram, and this is happening right now. I mean, if you look at just the Happy Flow project in Aruba, and there's other projects in Asia where they're beginning to actually look at a fully self-managed process through airports and through other border points. One of the things that I think is going to get layered on top of this is I think, and this is really goes to this notion of introducing multimodal biometrics. I believe what's going to happen is that we will have biometrics that are linked to our core credentials, our passports, and whether that is a booklet or whether with a chip in it or whether it's a mobile application on our smart device. But what I believe is going to happen is that there will be those biometrics that are used in that capacity to link us to our digital identity, to link us to an issued credential. But ultimately, I think the process through these port facilities, I believe, is going to be based on a temporary biometric, and I think it has to do with managing PII, it has to do with data protection and privacy, and so that we will create temporary revocable biometrics that we will use to move through these spaces, and those could be issued, at the time we check in, at the time we go to this facility and link our credential to our identity, and then you can revoke that when someone goes through a boarding gate and boards an airplane or a cruise ship or goes across a land border. When you're actually traveling across a distance to another location, we could also have an integrated system where that temporary revocable biometric exists until you actually reach your destination and clear passport control at that and customs at that destination. So I believe that this idea of issuing a revocable temporary biometric, maybe multiple revocable biometrics depending on how the system works, is going to kind of be the next step in the evolution. And then I think finally, as we're looking really to the future, and this future may be right around the corner, is really integrating what I call passive identification and authentication, and it's really based on the idea that we now have a range of touchless biometrics. Go ahead to the next slide, Peter. Touchless biometrics and completely non-invasive biometrics, passive biometrics that allow you to move through spaces and have your biometrics captured. This could be facial recognition, it could be iris. Morpho has their Morpho Wave Tower where you're sort of, kind of gliding your hand over a reader. And I think eventually we're moving towards this model where you're going to move through these public spaces. And I think ports are probably the first place it's going to happen, but it may happen in other places as well. And that identification authentication is something that's going to happen in the background, and we're just going to take it for granted. And that, to me, when we get to that place, that's when we're really leveraging the power of biometrics, when we're leveraging the power of this kind of secure facilitation that I think really is the long-term vision of the marketplace. The things that I think about when I think about this process, where we are today in this current evolution, are sort of balancing these choices that we make: registered versus non-registered travelers, active versus passive identification, how we're moving from one to the other, credential-based versus cloud-based identity. In Australia now they're talking about getting rid of passports and being able to just use automated border control based on biometrics alone. This idea of a permanent identifier that links you to a credential or a digital identity versus a temporary token, what it means to use a single biometric, what the context for that is versus multiple biometrics, facilitated versus fully automated processes, like a facilitated process like I described with the APC versus this grand vision of full automation. And then finally, fixed versus mobile. How are these systems going to work, and what kind of technology solutions are we going to use to enable them? So with that, hopefully I've spurred some thinking in your minds. I want to turn it back over to Peter and let's see what kind of a discussion we can get going here.
Thank you very much, Max. As always, excellent research. Now I'd like to introduce our two other panelists. Again, today we are very fortunate to have two of the true leaders in our industry, and I really mean that. Both are strong, experienced voices in our industry. Joining us from MorphoTrack is Janice Keppert, Director, Homeland Security Solutions. And our second panelist is from NEC of Americas, Benji Hutchinson, Senior Director, Washington, D.C. Operations. And I'm going to jump right in. And the first question, any regular attendees of our webinars will have noticed an emerging trend across our featured topics. The whole biometric industry across nearly every vertical is turning toward multimodal solutions. How are we seeing multimodal solutions deployed in border control? What benefits do they have over single modality systems? And Benji, if I could ask you please to start us off on this one.
Sure, Peter, and thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Thanks, Max, for that intro. A lot of what you said really rings true, especially for the deployment of multimodal technology on the border. You know, it's interesting, as Max is going through her comments there, to note that Asia and Europe, by way of eGates, they're pretty far ahead when it comes to taking a secure token and another biometric or a few biometrics. In the U.S., we're still more kiosk-based, but what you're starting to see along the border, specifically with Department of Homeland Security initiatives, is a migration towards multimodal solutions. So one specific example is everyone is probably familiar with the ident system, which is DHS's large-scale biometric repository for biometric samples. Well, that database is always evolving, and it's getting larger and larger every day. It's in the hundreds of millions of records, and it's primarily been fingerprint. They've taken a face image, but they've not done much with it. You're starting to see that capability be built out, and it's going to continue to trend along those lines over the next several years, 5 years or so. And that's just on the back end. So that's for large-scale multimodal matching for the software at the enterprise level. But beneath that, you've got an interesting story as well that's much more visible, right? So along the borders, where you've got, you know, whether it's air or sea or land, you've got entry and exit ports where Customs and Border Protection are doing pilots to see how folks crossing the border can interact with devices that collect face images or collect fingerprints, and how those can be compared along with a secure credential, such as a border crossing card or a passport, to make sure the person is who they say they are, and that they don't overstay their visa, and that they leave legally and re-enter legally. So you do see a lot of these initiatives coming online. And you know, as far as the benefits, it's greater accuracy. You see better performance in these systems, especially the ones that use fusion. You see these in a lot of other large-scale government agencies. It's more flexibility. You've got more options. You don't have to use a fingerprint only. You can also have a face, which has some advantages. You can collect that at a little bit of a further distance if you don't have the opportunity or you don't have the throughput for a fingerprint. But it's also safer because you're checking against more databases. The Intel community and a lot of folks who keep us safe, they've relied on face for a number of years in addition to fingerprints. Fingerprints have been the gold standard for decades, but face has always been around, and it's one of the primary ways we distinguish identities as human beings. But it's also more secure and it's more convenient, and I think Max touched on a lot of those points. You're going to see multimodal solutions being deployed at the border because of these reasons.
Thank you very much, Benji. And Janice, could I get your take on this question, please? Janice, are you there?
Yes, I'm sorry. I had myself on mute. I apologize. I wanted to first thank you and Max for having MorphoTrack and having me, and I agree with much of what Max and Benji have said already, so I'm not going to repeat that. Benji listed the value of multimodal. I think we all agree on that. There are use cases, though, and I think from our perspective as vendors, it's really important to look at the use case of the customer. And they differ in border control environments extensively around the world, as Max alluded to. So you have some countries, and it also depends your use case. Your customers can vary in border control environments significantly as well. You may be working with the airport as the primary customer. You may be working with the immigration authority. You may be working with law enforcement, etc. So that also will drive whether it's going to be a multimodal or a single modality. I think the most important thing to say about the single modality is that you need to start with a baseline of identity verification. And you can run it off that e-passport with a one-to-one face from the passport to the individual and use that as your contactless, your contactless token through the entire system, depending on what your use case is. So if you have multi-needs for that border control environment like we do in the United States, where it's a law enforcement as well as a security function for immigration information as well, then you have multiple needs for multiple biometrics. You need fingerprint, you need face off the passport. In other environments, you may only need face as a single modality. So I think it just depends. But I agree with Benji on the multimodal value as a whole.
Thank you very much, Janice. And the second question, biometric border control is being used across the globe. What are the best practices that should be observed to find success in the border control market? We've already talked about the multimodal aspect, but what other things should we be thinking about? And Janice, can I ask you to start out on this one, please?
Sure. So I assume, I'm going to answer this, that we're assuming about best practices for our customers, which would be governments on the whole, or airport authorities, depending. So if you look at it from a government perspective, I think you start from the idea of this needs to be a private-public partnership, that we are in an era of increased travel, increased threat of terrorism. The technology core becomes incredibly essential. It is also complex and difficult. So private industry is providing that to government, and government needs to be open to that partnership. That being said, you need a willingness on the government's part to be able to make a decision about both their operations and the modalities they want. And oftentimes they can't do that until we back up further to testing and benchmarks that will help drive those requirements. We need an industry well-documented requirements, but we understand that government can't get that often until we have the testing. So it's really driven by a public-private partnership. And then within that, we as industry have to help government with security protocols, adequate training, retention of biometric and privacy plans, adequate signage at ports of entry, auditable, transparent systems are all piece and parts and parcel of what really needs to go into best practices from our point of view.
Thanks, Janice. That's a great answer. Benji, can I get your take on this one, please?
Sure, absolutely. And as far as best practices go, I think public-private partnerships, I think Janice mentioned that as well. Working closely with customers is specifically when you're dealing with federal customers, whether it's a government agency, that's important. But also, making sure that these technologies are integrated in a way that's highly usable. Making sure that they're practical and pragmatic. For a long time, biometrics was considered a technology that was new and shiny, and in some instances, years and years ago, difficult to implement in certain ways. And I think a lot of that's changed. The technology's become much more widespread, become a lot more easily obtainable, and so flexibility and usability have all been best practices that have been, there's been a lot of resources spent on that. So I think those are all important points when you think about how can you implement these technologies in a more seamless manner.
Thank you very much, Benji.
Peter, can I just chime in on that quickly too? I also would think that one of the things that's really important, and I think Janice and Benji sort of set up the framework for this, which is these are very country-specific solutions and location-specific solutions, right? Every country has their own requirements. Every facility has their own requirements. And so one of the real challenges is how do you manage those customized solutions within the individual arena and at the same time build a global infrastructure. And I think this is really one of the pressing challenges for the industry.
Thank you, Max. And actually following in on that then, I'm going to ask another question, and that is, you know, you mentioned some of the regional aspects of this thing. Given the emerging migration trends, what are some of the obstacles that government agencies need to overcome in order to deploy biometrics as part of a border control program? So Max, you started to talk about those regional differences. Maybe you could, can you comment on the emerging migration trends too?
Yeah, I think it goes right to what I was saying, which is, you know, every country, these are sovereign programs, and as you know, Janice and Benji said, they're private-public partnerships. So the industry is providing solutions, but each country has their own specific requirements, and so obviously immigration doesn't recognize boundaries, especially when we're talking about the kind of refugee crisis we've seen going on in the Middle East and Northern Africa. And so there's really this challenge of how do you coordinate and maintain your own sovereign system in a sense, and adhere to your own data protection and privacy rules and regulations. And, you know, as Janice said, in some cases a single identifier works, and in the model that I was talking about, you know, having this sort of temporary revocable biometric to move through a border control space may be critical because of the requirements in terms of managing identity data. And so this is a huge problem, and we have, you know, there have been attempts to create you know, cross-border alliances around some of these automated systems. You have some in Europe, obviously, where you know, within the EU there's shared standards. But so it gets back to this notion of metrics and standards, and even, you know, in terms of what Janice was saying, is really understanding capabilities and having some way to accurately set metrics and determine performance. It's not an easy problem to solve, and I believe it's going to be solved iteratively. I don't think we can sort of say, okay, yes, we're going to impose this large solution. I think it's going to be sort of an iterative piecemeal process where we begin to be able to connect parts and pieces to solve specific urgent driven by, you know, illegal immigration and refugees. And then I think going forward we're going to start to build a more comprehensive global system that respects individual sovereignty of nations, but also allows for more interoperability globally.
Thank you very much, Max. This is such an important issue. Benji, can I get your take on this one, please?
Absolutely. So, you know, as far as what governments should overcome, number one, there is a fallacy around the resources element. You know, for decades, biometric systems have been considered really expensive and out of reach, and that's just not the case anymore. A lot of aspects of this industry have changed. The prices have come down. The solutions have matured. So that's number one. And government agencies are getting closer to this understanding. But also, I think it comes down to communication. That's number two, and a dialogue between these countries. And there are mechanisms and forums within which they, you know, they have these discussions. NATO, for example, has their own standard for biometrics, and it's closely aligned with United States standards for data exchange. But it's also sharing policies, and a lot of agencies, they say that they do this well, but sometimes they struggle. And so that's where you have to have a good dialogue between these different agencies to make sure that they're talking about these issues, because these countries approach these things vastly differently, and they have different requirements for people migrating across their borders. And so organically, their policies are going to grow in different ways and mature in different ways. But if you have a dialogue open, and, you know, countries are talking about these issues and making sure that they're working towards solutions that work for both, that's successful. You know, the last thing is standards, and I think standards are important. You know, I was a standards geek for years, and I appreciate the standards more than anybody. But there are a lot of standards, a lot of data sharing standards, and you just have to make sure, and as a member of industry, we're very sensitive to that. I'm sure Janice is too. I know both companies, and a lot of companies are, to making sure that those standards are implemented in the technologies. But these governments need to make sure that they are using the same standards when they start sharing that data after they've got the right policies and they've got the right dialogue going.
Thank you very much. Janice, anything to add to this particular issue?
Actually, I do maybe a slightly different perspective, because before I came to Morpho, I was the Americas director for an international agency called, international organization called Border. And, you know, we were supporting border agencies around the world come together to talk about things like industry standards, you know, interoperability, baseline border control support and environments. And I will tell you very candidly that border control international cooperation is extremely immature compared to other types of international cooperation. It is not at the level of law enforcement, which has Interpol and other agencies. It's not where the military is with NATO and other organizations around the world. They are struggling to figure out who each other are, figure out a forum to speak in, figure out how to get best practices involved. Traditionally, this has been, the border agencies have traditionally been sort of bottom tier agencies in government, not well moneyed, not well educated, and so this has become, because of 9/11, because of the increase in terrorism, an ever important element in control for nations. But it's still nascent, it's still immature, and so there's a lot of work that we can do, I think, to try to help these agencies come together and have the discussions that Benji just mentioned. So just from that perspective, I think that that is a huge obstacle, and just lessons learned and knowing and supporting each other around the world. If they can take care of their own house first, they can then and control their own borders better, which a lot of nations have no border control, especially in Africa, very little. You can move on to getting in place international standards. And Maxine mentioned we're going to be at 90% by 2020 on e-passports being issued around the world. That is through ICAO, an excellent international organization that has really worked to up security, but we need more of that. So that's my addition to that question.
Janice, very interesting. It sounds like there's still a lot of work to be done to try and bring this information sharing, very important issue forward. But I'm going to shift gears. We're getting a lot of questions in from our attendees, but I want to ask one final question to the panel here today, and that is, what about the average citizen? Will consumer mobile identity eventually play a role in border control? And Max, I'm going to ask you to start off on this one. You gave some information about, you know, this particular area. What about the average citizen? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, you know, I think what's happening is that our expectations are changing in terms of what we can control, in terms of our mobile devices, how we manage our identities, how we manage our day-to-day lives, and the ideas that we have about what kind of information is going to be contained in our mobile devices. I also think if you look at it generationally, you know, millennials and below, their expectations of how you interact with businesses, with governments, with your peers is dramatically changed because of this global biometric smart device platform that we are rolling out into the world, and that's only going to increase. And so I think, you know, consumers are going to come to expect, you know, consumers trust travelers in this case are going to come to expect that they can use these devices readily to facilitate processes. I think that we're going to have challenges, particularly in the developing world, to some extent, where we don't have the same kind of sophisticated infrastructure, although if you look at what's happening in certain areas of the world, even though they're using very primitive, or not, by our standards now, very primitive mobile devices, there's still a lot of sophisticated transactions going on. And so I think what we're going to see is sort of, you know, feature phones, if you will, these, like, you know, unsophisticated mobile devices are going to essentially disappear. Smartphones, you know, even cheap smartphones are going to become sort of the standard, and the expectation is the capabilities of those are going to allow us to manage our digital identities. And so then the question is, you know, why if my ability to authenticate myself with my bank, or to go get government services, which may be facilitated through a mobile device and national identity credentials that are embedded in it, if that has become so much simpler, if that has become so much easier, and that is moving rapidly into the digital world, why are we relying on sort of these archaic processes to identify people, to authenticate people in terms of border security and moving through transportation hubs? It just so I think it's going to change what people want. It's going to push, as Janice said, there's huge issues about how this stuff works globally, and I think it's going to put a lot of pressure on especially leading Western nations to really get up to speed and make it work.
Well, thank you very much. And Janice, can you weigh in on this one for us as well, please?
Sure. Let's go back. Remind me again, where did we start with the question? Because Maxine said so many interesting things there that I got lost in her commentary.
It's more about what the average citizen and what role mobile identity will eventually play in border control. It seems to be moving in that direction, but so mostly around that.
I think the biggest problem, and Maxine has said it already, is that you need the back-end infrastructure to make it work. And that is going to be the biggest problem. NEC, Morpho, other companies can build out identity management systems, but the countries have to be able and willing to do that to make a system like that work. And so right now, I think, I more tend to agree with the president of IATA that Max mentioned, where the e-passport booklets are here to stay at least for some time. Until that identity management system can get built throughout the world, because any glitch in that will make those systems hard to use if you're just using your device for the ID. I think it's a great idea. We all have, all of our companies have technologies that can support that, but it's a matter of, can you provide the security on the back end? Can you provide the interoperability? Will you have COTS systems where everybody can information share? And so it becomes a little bit of, pie in the sky. We're looking at the clouds, kind of solution that I think is a little further out than perhaps any of us would want it to be.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm going to jump into we're getting a lot of questions from the attendees, and I'm just going to start to throw some of these out. And it has to do with what you were just talking about, Janice. But what if something goes wrong on the privacy front? Aren't we just waiting for a major breach to disrupt the momentum of biometrics as a credential system? Anybody want to take that one?
Yeah, Peter, this is Benji. I'll take that, and I'll answer it as a follow-on to the dialogue that just took place, the discussions that just took place. One of the most monumental shifts that we've seen happen is that, individual consumers and citizens have had to take a more active role in their identity, whether that's managing their identity, building out details about their identity on a Facebook profile or LinkedIn, or whether it's filling out forms and enrolling in government programs where they get certain benefits. For decades and decades, the onus has largely been on federal agencies to prove identity. They would issue a credential and they would make sure that their data was updated within their own systems, and it was sort of, the onus was on them. And so even though the citizen had the credential or a biometric file or identity in some data system somewhere, it's largely up to the government to maintain it. And so you got mixed results, right? But moving forward, you've got tectonic shifts in that whole paradigm. You've got consumers playing more of an active role. They actively want to see their identity managed or insured or protected, and so they're demanding more rights. And to the extent that there's a catastrophe like a data breach or theft, I think over time consumers will demand more and more protection, and you're seeing more of that built in. You've got options within a lot of platforms for opting out or for creating greater levels of security, whether it's longer PINs or doing away with passwords and PINs in lieu of something else for multi-factor authentication. But to sum up, I think what I'm trying to say here is that there is a shift between the government or consumer agencies being more responsible for identities, and more of that going over to the citizen being responsible for proving and shaping and ensuring some of their identity.
Thank you, Benji. I'm going to jump into some more questions here. A lot of questions about balancing security and convenience in the modern world, especially around border control and national security in the age of international terrorism. And how do you strike that balance between convenience and security? And who would like to take that?
Can I please take it? Since yep. I would like to, considering my background on the 9/11 Commission and terrorist travel and all of that, this has been a favorite buzz phrase and discussion point for a very long time in the policy world. You know, right after 9/11, it was always security versus facilitation, and I remember being probably the first one to argue in Congress that it's security and facilitation. Biometrics provide both. And you cannot have facilitation very well without biometrics, and you can't have security very well without biometrics. Therefore, they're hand in hand. I think we have to get out of the paradigm of thinking that this is a one versus the other. The identity, assuring that a person is who they say they are, protects them, protects the country that they're seeking to go to in terms of border control, and it provides a facilitation aspect, because once that assurity is there that the person is who they say they are, they can pass through, plus nobody else is taking their identity. So it is any checkpoint, whether it's any type of security access control checkpoint, the security and facilitation are both there. So to me, they go hand in hand, and it's the reason I'm in this industry.
Thank you all for your comments today. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of our attendees and also our panelists. We could talk all day about this particular topic, but we have indeed run out of time. And I'd like to say to everybody, have a great summer. We'll be doing our next webinar in September on criminal justice and law enforcement. And I want to thank you for attending Biometrics in the New Era of National Security and Border Control, and our sponsors, NEC and Safran, Morphotrack, and especially for Acuity Market Intelligence, and Max for her expert analysis today. This concludes our webinar today. Thank you for attending.